Welcome. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum. And I think there are probably a lot of repeats here in the audience, and there's certainly a lot of people from the mass timber community. So thanks for coming tonight, and thanks to the people online who will see this in the future, because as many of you know, or well, let me start with tonight's event, the lecture by Susan Jones here in the front on tall timber with a new title that she will post for you. But at the substance of this particular version or segment of the larger series that we call the Mass Timber Semester, we're exploring a whole range of ideas that are embedded in the exhibition that is around you, the audience here, in the gallery, around this exhibition, Tall Timber, The Future of Cities and Wood.
I'm thrilled to be here at the Skyscraper Museum in Battery Park in Lower Manhattan. It's been a huge honor to be part of this exhibition. I have to thank my friend Jeff Spiritos for kind of setting this all up here, the matchmaker between Carol and myself, and of course Daniel, who's been incredibly helpful behind the scenes. And all of you for coming out on an amazingly, probably maybe the most beautiful night of all of Manhattan's history tonight. So the fact that we have you all here is just really a huge honor. Thank you so much. I also want to make a preemptory introduction to my friend and architect colleague, Kirsten Slavin, who's going to be moderating this talk afterwards. And I just couldn't say how excited I was to have my dear friend having a conversation here, because we are from the Northwest, and your comment was so prescient, Carol. And I'm honored to be considered an incubator of mass timber ideas as a denizen of the Northwest for New York City, which has been so long a place that we as architects looked up to so highly in sort of their leadership. And even recently in the environmental community in Passive House with multifamily, you all have been leaders. The work that BEX is doing, for instance, working on adaptive reuse and environmental energy cooperation on the building stock of New York City has been extraordinary. So it's a real honor to be provoking and exciting and stimulating New York City here. This lecture is called On Carbon, Fire and Forests. And I did change the name. I will cover all of the themes, but when I began to draw out the things that were perhaps less well known about mass timber, I kept coming back to these in my heart. And so you're going to hear a little bit about that. Just a quick thing on atelierjones. We are based in downtown Seattle, all female-owned firm, female-led firm. We have currently offices in the Bullitt Foundation up on Capitol Hill, which is also known as one of the more sustainable buildings on the planet. At least back in 2013, it was the most sustainable building, and we've all globally learned from this building. I'm very honored to be associated with it today. But I also grew up in the Pacific Northwest, some third or fourth generation, depending on how you work it. This is a portion of my office at a retreat a couple of years ago, actually, in a forest that I do own as part of my family. It's a little retreat center that I built there. And the forests are really important parts of our DNA and how we experience the world and think about them every day. But a little bit about atelierjones, just very quickly. We have been known, as Carol mentioned, as national leaders in the mass timber space for over a decade, not quite 20 years, because I didn't even know about mass timber until I learned about it from my European friends, where I had worked for many years after finishing my degree at Harvard. But the work of the design work that we did in the first 3 or 4 years, which I'll touch on very, very briefly, kind of established a relationship with the AIA to national to go into this codes process, which I will talk about in more detail. And that really became the training ground. I mean, in the beginning, it was astonishing to think that our little firm could have 4 buildings out of mass timber completed, and these were 4 more than any other architect in the United States in 2017. So that quickly has changed now, and I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of the community having grown. But today we've completed some 12 or 13 buildings, and we have a couple more under construction and about 20 total in design that we've been working on. And so this timeline between design and research going back and forth across this 10 plus year timeline has been really important for us to just try to track the kinds of initiatives that we've been in from fire test protocols to competition designs to LCA life cycle analysis work that we've been doing to, of course, code development and yes, building, which is really the places that is close to my heart the most. We were lucky because nobody really knew that much about mass timber or cross-laminated timber. When I was looking for a place to, a technology, a way to build my house in 2012 and 13. And the emergence of this material was an incredible start that I knew about from Europe, but really didn't realize it had never been really tested that much in the US. A little bit in Canada, certainly, as you heard about a couple of weeks ago, but less here in the United States. So getting to know this material was an incredible part. I'm going to outlay about 8 themes that have been very important to my development and understanding of this material as an architect, as a designer. And I'm not going to go into detail because this isn't a lecture about design, but they're very important motivators to have kept me in this world and kept me stimulated and kept me excited about moving forward. So certainly the experimental aspect of this house was very important, and the experimental aspect of the technology. And it really was a house that was much in the way that we talk about Alvar Aalto's house, an experimental house in my little house, family neighborhood in Madison Park. Some of the themes that it kept emerging again and again and again. This is referencing Semper, of course, the tectonic, the weird thing about all these sticks coming together, making these gigantic stereotomic wall, huge panels, and the extraordinary quality of that transformation that this material that we all know, the stud, the 2x4, the 2x6, the lamp stock, and how they all created these massive walls, which make incredible spatial experiences. I kept going back again and again. This is a German apology, but Kernform and Kunstform. How do we make this constructive material into architecture? And it's been one of the challenges of my career to always constantly think about what the contractor needs, to constantly think about what the process needs, but how to make art and architecture. Of course, the prefabrication was an extraordinary learning experience for me, diving deep into those constructive logics to understand better how we can make this process, how we work with the contractor, work with the process, a vertically integrated team to create these often hybrid structures, which so often get overlooked in our language and the way we talk about these mass timber buildings, when of course there's all concrete and steel embedded in them. How we can measure the trees, measure the amount of cubic meters of cubic footage of the wood in these buildings, how we can measure the carbon, and how we can even measure the amount of trees it takes and the amount of land it takes to grow and nurture those trees. That was an astonishing thing that we can measure. We can't measure concrete, we can't measure steel. Where does it all come from? We can measure weights and volumes, but we can't know where those buildings come from. And so that brought me to this notion of regionality, which Carol was discussing earlier. And I really tried to make a pledge as deep as I can go to work within my region of the Cascadia biome. And that includes Northern California, all the way up to southern BC and west to Smartland over in Montana, and to work with those regional suppliers to begin to build connections throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. And this is not just a model, of course, for Cascadia. This is a model for the Northeast, where you all have the opportunity to work with your northern climes in Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire, and of course, your upstate New York, and build that same regionality of 5 hours from New York City to Bangor, Maine. So just a little bit, I'm just going to touch on these 2 or 3 design process projects in the beginning. This is our CLT house. It's been well talked about, well publicized. I don't really need to go into detail, but I thought I would just give you some overview of the value of the intensity of the prefabrication process, the beauty of it, the hybridity of the way steel is used versus the planes of CLT, the kinds of spaces that developed off this very awkward and very difficult triangular lot, a pure isosceles triangle, and some of the spaces that resulted in them, and how they struck this note, this chord of biophilia, to use a fancy word, but it was just really being in love with this experience of wood and waking up in the morning with your bare feet and padding to the bathroom. The CLT church came shortly after that. We actually were designing it as the CLT house was under construction. It's really just a wall in the backdrop of a sanctuary of a 50,000 square foot renovation of an existing office building into a space of gathering to create awe And the experimentation that went on with this building of using 17 40-foot high panels as they cascaded, undulated softly across the back of that wall was an extraordinary journey from a paper model to Revit models to Rhino models to in between beautiful wood models that we made by hand and had them tested in a daylighting lab at the University of Washington. And again, the themes of hybridity came up and again because steel and wood were working together. And how do you bring those two together to make the kinds of beauty that the mass timber projects could live with? So at this point, I had finished this church. I was very happy with these projects. We were at 2 small schools under construction, and I got a call from AIA National. It was 5 days before this deadline was due to join the code committee in July. It was May at that point, May of 2016. I was on the street and I had my mobile phone in my hand, and they said, you want me to apply for this position to sit on the code committee? You don't know where, you don't know how long it's going to last. You want me to fill this application out? I knew about the code committee. I had said to myself, I'm not going to apply for this code committee because it just seems like a huge ball of wax. I have enough work on my hands. I'm excited about where the back practice is going. All the mass timber is excited. They're new for the taking. And you want me to go sit in a conference room for how long? You don't know? For no money? No. Oh, expenses paid. Oh, okay, cool. That's great. Thank you. Sure, but there's like 5 people in Seattle that I know really well that are so excited about being on this committee. They've been talking to me about months, asking me, "You're not going to apply, are you?" No, I am not going to apply. Do not worry. And all of them, I said to the guy on the phone, know the code better than I do. I love the building code. Don't get me wrong. I'm a professional architect. I have to love the code. But do I want to work and change that code? I could not imagine. Please choose the other people. Then no, we want you to apply. No, we want you to apply. They called again. They called again. They called again. They emailed. And after 5 outreaches, I put it in. Well, that began a process that was an extraordinary process of sitting in these conference rooms up here. I call them my bad Chicago O'Hare conference rooms, and no light, no ventilation. Working with a group of fire community. There was a balanced committee, but there was like 6, 7 fire people out of 18 of them, and working on these fire tests, and I'll show this in more detail, and then developing a series of codes, passing them in 2019, and then doing it again with some Swedish fire tests, and then passing another round in 2022, and then building Heartwood, and all the time doing more research in the area of the LCA work and carbon analysis things. And it became almost a parallel track in our practice that I had to acknowledge was taking extraordinary time and energy. We built a practice around it, as well as continuing our design work as much as possible. But for about these 4 or 5 years, my heart was really devoted. This balance committee, as I mentioned, was made up of superior people. There was Sam Francis, sort of sainthood, that dude. Steve Giovanni there, the chair of the committee, he's the fire chief of Las Vegas. Not the fire chief, he's the head of the fire ordinances for Las Vegas. Lots of high rises. He's had to go up in high rises and watch out for burning buildings. He has every incentive not to allow tall buildings to go ahead in wood. But he goes out in the line again and again and again and made this process happen. It was an extraordinary thing, but we also had concrete at the table. We had steel at the table. And as I said, we had 6 fire guys, 7 if you include Steve. And the extraordinary balanced makeup of that community was what allowed the codes to begin to flourish and work with each other after we did these fire tests. Because up until this point, the fire community was just sort of shining us off. It felt like it anyway. And I mean that with respect to all of those colleagues, because they really came a long ways. We had proposed as a community of code people on that committee to use data-driven research. We were not going to be political or scratch people's back or, work on economic relationships or handshakes behind the scenes. We were going to create the toughest, baddest, difficult fire tests that had ever been tested, as far as we knew on this globe, according to American fire standards, which is a very critical thing. I didn't understand that American fires could be different than European fires, could be different than Swedish fires or different than Canadian fires. But believe me, Sean DeCrane convinced me that there was a difference between all those fires, and I actually came to believe it. out of deep respect. So we created, you can see all this IKEA furniture in here. This thing is a mess. This is the highest fuel load, and that's a technical term. The highest fuel load that we knew at the time that had ever been burned up in flames. And you can see the glow underneath the kitchen cabinet, just like you'd have a fire in your apartment, and you might be under the kitchen cabinet with the stove, and it starts on fire. We built these 2-story compartments outside of Washington, D.C. at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. We built these 2 stories with an exit stair in the back and a corridor and a 20-minute door that goes out to the hallway, just like you would in any conventional area. We built big windows that were actually open, so the maximum amount of ventilation. And the reason why we left them open is because all the fire guys knew they would blow out in about 20 seconds anyway. 2 minutes after flashover. And so there was no reason to have this. In fact, we wanted to have that, I didn't, they wanted to have this increased ventilation going up so they would have the maximum impact of the fire impact in these units. Now, underneath all this gypsum wallboard is mass timber structure, of course, but they were also very conservative about how much they were exposing. And so the process went on and on about negotiating. This picture on the right is at the inside the viewing compartment, and we're looking down at the beginning of what's called flashover. Again, a technical term. It happens when it's the maximum, when the fire goes from a contained fire to an out of control fire, and you don't want to be in there. You have about 2 minutes, everybody, to get out of your compartment. But the idea is that before flashover, yeah, I saw your face. But the idea is that you have 2 minutes to get out, and that the fire stays in that compartment. So that's what we were testing, that the compartment wouldn't burn down. We built these 5 times. We set 5 fires, and we tried to bring them down, and we could not burn them down. So this is a picture that I took for test number 3. I'm out here in Baltimore in some suburban gigantic warehouse. It's with the national ATF. And I'm looking through, this is wire glass. And we're about, it doesn't look like it, but we're about 100 feet away. And we can feel the heat on the inside of that 1/4-inch glass. These fire tests were extraordinary. They were designed by the best fire minds in the country. There was about, I think there were several thousand, I'm not positive, but several thousand data points, sensors inside the wood, deep inside the wood, to see if the temperature would be infiltrating into the wood, because that would, of course, add to the fuel load, and then they wanted to make sure it was actually hot enough inside or not hot enough. And they were surprised it wasn't hot after about 1.25 inches, maybe 1.5 inches. My daughter is there with her baseball hat on. We were there because after going back, after this point, this is flashover. We are waiting for 3 hours. Well, we're waiting really for 4 hours, but we only had to wait for 3 hours to see if this fire would either go out or burn the structure down or what happened. And what happened, so this is like hour 2.5, and people are getting a little bored. My daughter is like, why am I here? Why did I come with you, Mom? What's going on here? And at the end of that 3 hours, you can see it's a total mess in there. All those contents have burned down. Much of the gypsum wallboard has burned down, but the structure stands. So now imagine you're in a high rise and there's this catastrophic fire on unit B on the 17th floor. Now you're in unit C down here, everyone's gotten out of the building anyway, it's 3 hours. There's been no sprinkler intervention and no fire department intervention. The fire department couldn't make it that day. The sprinklers all broke. We made the worst case possible scenario for this moment. And in fact, the structure, the building, the high rise was still standing. And that's a very important case. We didn't mind that it looked like this because people have gotten out. We just wanted to make sure that the structure stayed intact. And that's the main takeaway, that all of those fire folks on the committee were in awe and somewhat shocked by it. They were truly surprised that this was the outcome of this. You can see a little technical piece over there of the side of the CLT. That's what the walls and the ceilings and the floors are made out of, the 5-ply over there. There's only this much damage of it. And that structural layer is those 3 layers of the structure are still standing. Then I had the, I guess, misfortune or it's something. I was persuaded to go to do some tests in Sweden, which I didn't get to go because it was COVID. But we did 5 more tests in Sweden in the fall of 2020 in an outdoor facility, because the heat intensity from the ATF tests had been so great that we couldn't actually trust ourselves. We wanted to make sure there was enough heat going through there in a natural condition with ventilation. So we tried the same thing. And while this doesn't look like a fun place to be, you don't want to be in there in a fire, Again, the structure stayed intact, and this time we had the entire ceilings opened up, we had the entire walls opened up. And those were the things that began to allow ourselves to really make the code with confidence. Now, around 2019, in January, I had the privilege, I was terrified actually, to be honest, to go and speak to the fire department of New York City. It was after the codes had passed. I was there with my fire colleague, Sean DeCrane, who had, I think I can say this, Sean had voted against the process for the codes 15-3. He was one of the 3 people, but he kind of in his heart knew that this was an okay technology. And he went out of his way. He was working for UL Listing at the time. And I'm very grateful to Sean because he really acted as a provocateur in an intelligent and helpful way. And he brought me to Randall's Island up north, wherever we are, on the side of Manhattan. And there I am. And if you look carefully, I'm giving a presentation, sort of like this one, to about, I don't know, 100 firemen, I think they mostly were. And I think Kareem Khalifa was actually in the audience. That was really fun. But there is Daniel Nigra, and I don't know if any of you know him, but he was your New York City's 33rd fire commissioner in New York City. He retired in 2022 after an illustrious 35-year career, and he's introducing this whole day of conferences on fire. And you can maybe, if you look closely, you can see a picture that maybe looks familiar. That's my house. The experimental photo that I showed about 20 slides ago. And the shock of standing there in the wings, kind of like I was a few minutes ago, and walking, and knowing I was going to walk up and practically follow this guy, there was an introduction in between, follow this illustrious person and talk about our house of CLT and the code process and the fire test was really humbling, I would just say. Daniel was an extraordinary person. His team was extraordinary, incredibly sophisticated, smart, thoughtful people that said to me, unprovoked, we are not worried about mass timber in New York City. We're not worried about the final buildings. We're only worried about what happens when they are under construction. We need to make sure we are regulating that highly, as was the code committee, and we had a set of regulations already addressing those issues. But those compartment tests have done their job to convince fire officials in the United States, including New York City, to adopt this technology, and they're one of the foundations of the codes in New York City today. So you can see the stress on my face. That's 2018 in April. We're passing those tests. We're passing those codes. We're all testifying. We have 2 minutes. It's exactly 2 minutes. You can't speak more than 2 minutes, and they cut you off mid-sentence, whatever it is. I think I made it through. I had to practice a lot. And then we passed those codes. This was the main body of codes, about 68% passage rate. And then they were later passed on the national level by looking at what all fire code officials, all code officials could weigh in. So today, after the 2 cycles, the 21 cycle and the 24 cycle, we have an entire complete body of codes, which can be adopted by any jurisdiction in the United States, by authorities having jurisdiction from cities, communities, states. And they can also, the language can be adopted on a building by building case by case basis to adopt this language, because they can take confidence that these codes have been vetted, they have been processed, and they have been worked through at a very extraordinary level. We were taking 3 different approaches: Type 4C, Type 4B, Type 4A. As you can imagine, it's 8 stories, 12 stories, well, 9 stories technically, 12 stories, and 18 stories. We did try to get 40-story towers through. We tried hard. We tried a lot to get them. We got rejected and pushed down every time. We went down to 32. At the last moment, I raised my hand and said, I'm going to make an motion to go up to 24. It was even 20. I got 4 votes or something. 18 was as good as I could do. And now, of course, this is a picture from Heartwood, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it allows, the Type 4B allows all of the ceilings to be exposed. Type 4C, which Heartwood is, allows all of the structure, superstructure to be built and exposed, and walls if we wanted it. And these code changes are not. So today, this is the outcome of the transition from smaller scale projects, which were known in the US up until about 2018 and codified until 2018, to the codes that allowed 8 to 9 stories, 12 stories, and 18 stories that are codified as of right today in the United States for jurisdiction, for the adoption. And these are also, of course, the codes that New York City codes are based on. They are slightly different than the type 4 type 4 codes. They're closer to the type 4C, and they're kind of a melange of type 4C and type HT, but they use many of the fire protection initiatives that we've used here in the type 4C, and they're very similar once you get beyond a couple of small regional differences. So the wonderful thing about this story is that I get to go back to being a real architect again and designing buildings again. And here we are in Seattle again, working on a workforce housing building, thanks to a grant from the U.S. Forest Service. It was a kind of catalyst to our clients, for this community to take the risk that they felt was necessary to build a type 4C. So this is one of the first type 4C buildings in the US. It's certainly not the tallest mass timber buildings. There's a number of examples. Ascent, for instance, at 25 stories in the US is much taller. And but it was an extraordinary process that atelierjones led the design of. It's on a parking lot right next to a small brick building that the existing owner built, had managed. It was a 1908 building. And this was also deeply affordable housing, this 4-story building in the back here. And we had the great fortune to be able to build on a parking lot in the middle, in the heart of Seattle. Heartwood on the right, this is the view from that same perspective, is an 8-story, 126 unit, mostly studios and 13 warm beds. Project for incomes about 80% of average median income, which is quite high in Seattle, as you may expect, from the growing influx of tech workers into into Seattle. So 113 studios, 67,000 square feet, an 8-story building with, and we were able to, it's a very simple building, but we were able to invest a fair amount of the lower ground plane into the pedestrian experience and add the amenities as inside and outside corridors and sort of an inside-outside street, which these diagrams begin to talk about. A very dense area for Seattle, 4 or 5-story buildings, 6-story, 7-story buildings. This is the tallest building in the area, but I don't expect it to be for long, certainly not for the next generation. The figure ground talking about the parking lot and the relationship of the new building to the old. And then these 2 floor plans, the existing floor plan of the 1908 building, the Helen B, and Heartwood, and the way the indoor-outdoor street begins to work and connect those spaces of the lobby with the lobby of the outside community and the shared courtyard that was shared by both populations. And I'll just go over some of these plans, and it's been published. It's been Joanne Gonchar just put a nice article out at in Architectural Record last month. So a lot of this has been explained in more full detail. But to see this courtyard really come to life with people today has been a really beautiful thing as an architect to see your project really take life. The units are quite small. This is the smallest unit, 321 square feet. The average square footage is 400. This is the studio, of course. And we've exposed the timber. You can just see the little bit of the columns on the left side of that small floor plan. And it's harder to see in this image, but there are columns embedded into the wall on the right side of that. We were very judicious about where and when we would expose the timber based on MEP needs and ventilation needs within these small units, and how to reduce the amount of soffits in these projects as much as possible to reduce those concealed spaces that are expensive to build, whether you're in New York City or whether you're in Seattle. Some early renderings of the interiors with some final photos on the right, and just a little bit of elucidation about the types of the grids and the types of the units. We did not have a standard grid. People always ask, what's your standard ideal grid? We did not, because we were designing to the site. We were designing to the pro forma of the project, and we needed to get this project built and have as many units as possible. So the good news about that is we used every grid from 12'1" to 18'8", and we all know how much they work and how deep the beams all need to be, and change a little bit. Kept them similar in the units and then change them for you. I love this slide because this is just a really a beautiful axon about the hybridity. This is all the steel in the project, and how that translated into these different grids. Because of course we're in a seismic region, so one of the other innovations was this was one of the first tall seismic buildings in these units. This is a couple things we're really proud of, and I have to give a lot of thanks to my partners on this, DCI Structural Engineers out of Portland and Timber Lab, who's now here in New York City, but they were based at that time in Portland, and Swinnerton Construction, who was the general contractor on this project. But this all wood joint is an extraordinary montage and of looking at old ancient Japanese joinery and how we combine those in very large prefabricated massive ways to create these all wood joints, which have intumescent tape in them for fire protection, which was absolutely critical. We needed to negotiate with the city of Seattle to do that, but as well really creates this very flexible element for the future projects and happens to save $5 a square foot in steel and lower its carbon footprint. The image on my left here with the green floor plates, the notion there is that this building is also future-proof. What I'm showing there is the idea that you can take these demising walls down between the units that are all just light gauge metal in the future. You can take out some kitchens, you could redo the exterior of the building in 100 years, when this building has maybe reached a lower lifespan, and the superstructure remains. And you can put those units back as 3-bedroom units, 2-bedroom units, 4-bedroom units, offices, whatever one might need in 150 years. And this building can be built almost entirely again and saved for another 150 years. We project that this is going to be a 200-year, maybe 300-year building, but there's a tremendous amount of flexibility, which, as we all know, is incredibly important over time as these kitchens wear, as the exterior wears, and as taste changes over time. All of this was possible through a massive Revit model, BIM model, the building information model that we helped lead with Timber Lab and DCI on our servers. It really laid the groundwork for replicating this process in the future. I'm going to talk just a little bit now about carbon. Not only was the building an extraordinary performer in terms of embodied carbon, we did do a number of operational carbon things. We were meeting very stringent energy codes from the state of Washington. I won't go into detail here, but rest assured we did meet some very high standards of operational carbon that was necessary. But the innovation of this building was that we were able to quantify in a very clear and simple way the embodied carbon and the life cycle analysis, the LCA performance of this building. We had an additional grant of about $30,000 from the U.S. Forest Service to work in a partnership with the University of Washington to do this. And this is where the notion of scale really begins to make a difference. I'm going to walk over here. I think that's okay. Because these are the two comparisons of the amount of carbon it takes to build these two buildings. This is a concrete equivalent at 8 stories. We modeled it exclusively in concrete as a commercially viable building for an 8-story concrete with residential structure in a seismic zone, including the foundations. We modeled the superstructure in concrete, and then we modeled, of course, we had the model for Heartwood, and we modeled that superstructure. And comparing these two, those numbers, I don't know if you can see them, but 100% as a bar for concrete. Heartwood took 62% of that carbon, meaning that it was a 38% less of a carbon footprint to build. But that doesn't include all of the carbon that's sequestered or stored in the superstructure of Heartwood, which includes, as you can see over here, the quantifications of the superstructure itself, the stairs, both exit stairs were wood, the columns and beams, as well as CLT slabs, and then, of course, the concrete slab-on-grade foundation and the steel hybrid piece. So when you take this amount of carbon and you subtract it from there, you get a number that's minus 3%. And I've always wondered, can we really talk about mass timber being a net negative superstructure at scale? And with this study that was done by some of the best LCA scientists in the whole United States at the University of Washington, I can say to you all confidently that this building is net negative. And I'm really pleased about that. The reason I can say that also is because of the innovation of this end-of-life diagram, which we just presented about 2 months ago at the Mass Timber Conference. And it's really groundbreaking work that was done primarily by this amazing graduate student in this lab run by Engineer Ganguly at the University of Washington at the School of Forest Services. that begins to say, okay, well, Susan, you got 200 years, you just said a couple of minutes ago for this building to last. What if it actually lasts only 100 years? Okay, we'll be conservative and say 100 years. But the idea that all of these pieces would be then taken apart and put into these different panels. And yeah, you got to cut off 10%, so that's the red. And you got to take those pieces, but you make another Heartwood or some version of it for another 100 years. But meanwhile, you got to take the red stuff, and that goes probably into some plywood. And then after 100 years, that building comes down. Those are, again, conservative numbers. And all of that wood from the 200-year-old second Heartwood goes into plywood, et cetera. And, industry says you can recycle plywood, grind it up, make it into OSB for every 40 years, 3 times. But what happens after that? It goes into landfill. And so that's that green box, that green circle down there. And in that whole process, you're losing about 10% to the air. But in landfill, and these are from EPA statistics, about that is capped off. What does the number say? It's 86% and 12% load. And so the impact, one of the things that is talked about a lot is what happens after the building comes down. What is the end of life? And we were able to posit a very strong and legible case, and clearly understood case, thanks to Christina Jarvin, who did this for her PhD dissertation thesis. And we're really thrilled about this result. And that was what led us to confidently say that end of life is included in here as a net negative building. And you start multiplying that times buildings after buildings after buildings, 38% lower carbon just to build. And as well, looking at the stored carbon of this, and this really begins to make an impact at scale. As long as the wood is forested harvest sustainably, which Heartwood was. And I'm just going to show you some fun pictures of it under construction. This picture will never be seen again because it's all wrapped in 2 hours worth of gypsum wallboard now. But it was extraordinary seeing the hybridity stairs, the MPP stairs that we made into sculptures on the lower floor. Just seeing all that wood under construction. These are not concrete columns. They are actually just wood columns wrapped in Tyvek. Mount Rainier's out from somewhere. And the final building, again, very simple. As much work as we could do at the ground level to invest in the pedestrian scale, the scale of the unit, scale of the inhabitant. Some of those indoor-outdoor streets, the lobby as you come in. We had an amazing fixture magically donated to us by Stickbold from New York City up in Long Island. 2 beautiful fixtures which are made out of wood, reclaimed wood that Stickbold works with. The interiors of some of the units with those massive columns and things. Some of the units when they're in use. Great bike rooms. We got a lot of bike rooms in New York City. In Seattle, where am I? The hallways, the mass timber, MPP floors, stairs in there. And now we're ready to talk about replication. Having done this once before and built this as a team, this is a highly collaborative team that took 20 to 40 really serious people on this for about 4 years. This team is ready to do this again. And a lot of the hurdles were not about the wood, but they were about the fireproofing details and some complicated stuff that happened during the construction process, which frankly, those fire tests, we had to do them. But we also had to detail and we had to work with the contractors to get those to work. We've overcome a lot of those hurdles. We can anticipate them. We know what they are. And this team is ready to go and to move into the next level of replication. We know we have a flexible, simple to understand system that structurally can be accommodated in almost any jurisdiction in the country, any regional area, given that there's some 5-hour, 15-hour relationship to a mass timber manufacturer, whether it's for luxury housing at one end or the workforce housing or affordable housing or student housing at the other end. This is an amazing opportunity to really begin to think about the next generation of Heartwoods. So we were able to do a little study on this, and we're working on a publication on how this building can be replicated, looking at the differences in the structural grids. What are the key salient pieces of this that can be replicated, and what should be changed or what can be changed without messing with the system? But again, we found it to be flexible and usable in so many different ways. I'll just go through these different grids. Again, what is the perfect grid? What does it feel like when you go from 8 to 12 stories? What are the additional adds? And yes, there's some gypsum wallboard on the walls and the columns, but those ceilings are just as open as they ever were. And we're even looking at some projects at scale. You know, what if we did 15 Heartwoods on a site? How exciting would that be? And to begin to build, you know, 8 and 12 stories made out of the same exact system, using it again and again and again, times 15 for just a few acres of lawns. And the beauty of those projects and how they can come alive through their mass timber superstructure. So fun with wood and fun with scale and fun with cities, and let's keep it going. I'm going to talk about our New York City project really briefly because we're in very early stages, but I'm really honored to have Gisèle here from the EDC. And it's just been a wonderful initiative that New York City EDC has taken forward on this. Lots of risks and lots of things to push forward, and we're so thrilled to be part of the inaugural class of the Mass Timber Studios. Gisèle, thank you again. We have this wonderful site. It's absolutely glorious. It's vacant right now, as you can see. It's right next to our Carnegie Library up in Harlem, facing southward towards Manhattan, towards Marcus Garvey Park, looking down over the entire park of Marcus Garvey, with a little tiny little icon back there, a beautiful shrine, because it used to be a convent. It was built in 1946. The site is now vacant. But we're really thrilled to be part of this really extraordinary design for this site. The site was, the project had been designed by a former team. The owner had put that team on hold some years ago because they were pursuing a parking waiver, which it looks like it's looking good. I'll just say that quietly, to have this parking waiver granted for this particular site up in the 125th area district. And the project is now back thanks to the Mass Timber Studio, and we are looking at, as the new team on board, with a local team that I'll mention here, with Sage and Coombe Architect Record, DCI, Swinnerton Construction, which is based in New York City here, and Timber Lab, also based in New York City. Tanya Luthi, you mentioned earlier, Carol, spoke here at the Skyscraper Museum. Has really been a force in some of the New York City codes. This incredible vertically integrated team has been part of this really wonderful process through the EDC and the Softwood Lumber Board, jointly funded, to, in a big way, advance these two commitments, this major commitment for the Mass Timber Studio under the executive order for New York City to help decarbonize your buildings here in New York City. And we're thrilled, as I mentioned before, to be a part of this. I'm not going to go into much detail about this because of the project had been in design development when we took it over. There's actually a fair amount of detail in all these drawings, and I'm not going to bore you all. We've been working very closely with things like structural grids and layouts that we've been working on the last 2 months for this project, working with different assemblies, post and beam, post and plank, just using a basic CFS system with a glue down post and beam below. But one of the most exciting things is that we've been able to decarbonize the program as well as decarbonize the superstructure of the project, partially because of this parking waiver that we were granted or about to hopefully be granted. And there's a series of unexcavated, we took almost a floor and a half out of the basement, out of the sub cellar. And we were very thrilled to be able to do that, to bring that foundation up, bring the costs down, bring the amount of carbon embodied in the lower cellar area down as well by a significant amount. We're creating a little piazzetta, which was part of the original design, but we sort of enlarged on it and sort of shaped it around the experience of these massive wood columns, which are coming down and holding this project. And here's a very, very early rendering of how that would be perceived off of 124th. You come down those stairs into a lower sunken courtyard, looking out to a garden in the back and a little shrine in the back with 33 units above on an 8-story building, including the roof deck and the cellar. So we're really thrilled about this project, and we hope the pricing comes back. I'm going to just end here on a little soliloquy about forests, because these projects in mass timber really don't make sense without having sustainable forestry. And it's been one of the joys of this whole process to me to get to know the forests and to get to know foresters and people who know about forestry. I'm not a forester, and I never will be, but as much as I walked through them, enjoyed them, hiked through them, camped in them, I didn't really know about their structure and how they worked. And every forest is different. Your forests here in the New England area, Northeast, are very different from the Northwest, but they all have the same questions and same provocations and same needs for their health. And it's been an extraordinary journey. Our firm, this is Eleanor from our firm, and Adam, our structural engineer, Taylor Cabot's in the back there from the Timber Lab. We've invested a fair amount of time in understanding our forests and what they mean as organic ecological entities. We really care deeply about them. One of the things that really brought it home for me was a forest that I actually own in my family. It's a family forest of about 140 acres on a small island outside of Seattle called Orcas Island. And while we all love to think about this beautiful, ancient, old growth, protected national forest park, a lot of our forests look like that in the middle. And that's my forest. I'm embarrassed to say that. But this tree here, this is a Douglas fir. That one in the middle, that big one. My grandfather planted that Douglas fir in 1961, the year I was born. And up around it, because it was a clear cut. It been clear cut 3 times since 1900. My grandfather bought it in the 50s after the last clear cut. And it looked like a mess. It was clear cut, the whole thing. And he planted all of these Douglas fir. I call them my sisters because they were planted the same year I was born. But in that light, these hemlocks sprung up just like weeds all around it. And that's what the little tiny trees are. And nobody in our family had the energy, the ability, the knowledge, the interest, the time, the money, etc., to manage that forest. And this is an issue that's happening in the West, particularly, but it's happening in your forest here as well on the East Coast. That unmanaged forests, they're not necessarily natural. And I learned this from my friend Russ Vaughan of Logging Timbers. An unmanaged forest is not a natural forest. Somehow in my mind, if I just thought we leave it alone, it becomes natural. It's already been cut twice. It's already been touched by our human hands. And so managing that forest is a really critical thing. Otherwise, they end up like this forest, which is my land. Luckily, it was not burned, but that's the forest fires that invade your lungs here in the summer and August. So my husband and I, my family and I, friends of ours, have been managing this forest, and I'll go through these rather quickly. But you can see that top image in 1932, how barren the land is. And the land has actually come back with a lot of greenery in the last piece, and we've touched and treated about 10 acres of it. We've created this kind of informal community of family and friends, including Kristen and Lucas, who've been up there a couple of times, and including a local logger, Rich Harvey, from a 4th generation logging family on the island, to really help do our best to manage these forests as a volunteer effort over time, and to bring back some of the forests, quality of them, the mosses of the ground plane, and the openness and the access to them. This is just from 8 days ago when I was in the forest, and we've treated as a group about 25 acres of this forest over this last 5-year process. I think this was from last Monday, I was up there. It's a very, it's first of all, it's a great workout, but it's also an amazingly beautiful restorative place to be literally throwing these little 3-inch hemlocks around on the site. It's been a really amazing thing. So we built this little project up there as well, an 8x8 little restoration of this water tank shed. And I'll just end on these simple images of the restoration, taking it down off the mountain, adding new wood to replace the rotted wood planks from the 1940s, bringing a local contractor in with a very old crane, swinging that modular piece of Constitution shed into place. And now it just exists as a small accompaniment, a small sort of place of restoration and rest for those forest management crews, for that family and friends who help us manage these forests. And we have treats there. Come full circle. It's a beautiful place, and I urge you all to get to know the forests. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. That was a really wonderful, detailed overview of the amazing work that you've done, much of it unpaid, volunteer, for the betterment of all of us who are trying to do work in this field. So I've got some questions for you. I'll also take some audience questions, so start thinking about what you guys want to know from Susan. But I guess to start, since this is from where we ended, How does your experience managing your own forest continue to influence the design of your actual buildings and projects?
Great question. I mean, so, you get to know a tree and you think of these big trees in the old growth way, but you get to know these little tiny trees and in very small ways. And I think for me, it's mostly a sense of respect for the forests, of just how much it takes to grow a healthy tree and a biggish tree. Like we're not harvesting any big trees anymore, thank God. We're just harvesting these little, put this down before I spill it. We're harvesting 8 to 10 inches from the west coast, and at the Nordic land, we're harvesting actually 4 to 5 inches of the black spruce. And I think what's really been the most interesting is just to get to know the regionality of these forests. And like I always thought it was just Douglas fir forests were everywhere, because that's what I had grown up with, and these deep evergreen forests. But we know the forests of New England are very, very different in the forests, and how we use different wood species to create different panels widths and et cetera. And how each one of these buildings can take on a very regional aspect to them. I mean, seeing a building in Southern Yellow Pine, as you do down in the southeast area, or the projects that have been using Southern Yellow Pine, just being over in Mercer Mass Timber a couple of months ago and looking at all the Southern Yellow Pine coming up to Spokane, Washington, that's going back down to Conway, Arkansas, to build the Walmart headquarters. That kind of, and an extraordinary scale, that sort of experience of looking at these panels, which don't look anything like my house or Heartwood, and they're very different good tones and good colors, and I intuitively understand why that is. That a Southern Yellow Pine forest is going to be very different from a Douglas fir, very different from a black spruce up in northern Quebec, where a lot of the Nordic land products come down to the northeast and actually over to California as well. But I think that regionality really struck me hard, and just the deep respect for a healthy forest. We need more of that. We need more of that in our country, and I'm happy to be a spokesperson for that. If there was one thing I've been tempted to do in my career as a professional, is potentially forestry, besides architecture, of course. I wanted to be an architect since I was 5, but the only thing I've ever said to myself, maybe I could have done forestry, has been forestry. It's very funny.
Yeah, I think for me, like one thing that I've really loved about being in mass timber for the last, at this point, 10 plus years, which is kind of crazy to think about, is just the depth of knowledge that I've gained that is not my expertise, that is not my profession. Like I've talked to foresters, small family foresters. I've written sustainability policies and tried to understand what the social impact of that means so that we can just build buildings that are good, sustainable buildings. And I think that sort of, the collaboration that you talked about on the projects runs so deeply because we have this innate connection to this material that we don't have with concrete or steel. So people don't ask these types of questions. And I think that's something that's really, sticks with me every day.
Yeah, I gotta call out Kristen here. I mean, she has done such amazing work. She should give her own talk soon, and she probably will sometime. But I think there is, like, when I first met Kristen, I think it was at some dinner, she had me to speak in Portland. And I come in and she's like talking about how she had to find that fire test to give to the fire reviewer, because those codes that I helped write, they weren't around when she did her 8-story building, when she invented that together. And so all of their code work was performance-based, which, if you know anything about performance-based codes, it's deadly. You have to well, here's the fire test for that, and here's the equations for that, and here's the Excel spreadsheet that we had to write, or she had to write to prove that. And that kind of effort was, again, above and beyond that this theme of volunteer work or working beyond your fee, whatever that fee is a really extraordinary thing. And luckily we don't have to do that anymore because of our codes. It is prescriptive based code, and it's all codified. And that's why we went to the effort to do that. But to see somebody really work those numbers. In addition, the carbon 12 building was one that we based the type 4C on. So some of the decisions that the city of Portland and the state of Oregon and Kaiser Path had made to design that building were done based on that type 4C. So there really is this very symbiotic relationship, and yeah, she knows her stuff.
It's great lead into my next question, which is, as someone who was integral in writing the code and obviously knows it very deeply, probably more deeply than anyone else working in the field, were there any surprises that popped up during your actual implementation of that building code on Heartwood?
Yeah, there were, and I alluded to them, and I was kind of gentle there, but at the end, in the middle of that replication piece, but. So we spend so much time in the industry worrying about the wood. And, thank goodness we have partners like Timber Lab and DCI and Swinnerton and many other folks vertically integrated throughout the production process who understand the factories and the manufacturing process of the wood. And I feel like that's almost like some stuff we all know, and everybody knows. All of you architects know that. It's a easy, legible system. Despite it may not feel like that to everybody, but it really is. But what was harder about the tall timber stuff that I didn't expect, we got our building permit, we got our fireproofing details, we had them all drawn out on my stamp in the right hand corner. And yet then we had to implement them. And there were some construction coordination issues between the gypcrete sub and the gypsum wallboard sub and the fireproofing guy and the envelope guy and all their different groups of deflection joints. And none of this was that hard. It hadn't been quite done in that order before. And there was a lot of things that we as a team learned through that process, which I would like to save the next team that headache. And I think we can really do it very easily going forward. It wasn't that hard to figure it out, but we're in our office, we're creating templates for that understanding about how to do that more easily so that we can make it much easier for the next building owners coming. That was one of the main ones. There's a lot of things that we do.
So knowing that you could know the most about something and there's still going to be surprises, what recommendations do you have for the New York City building officials as they're adopting code and thinking about how to adopt code that they maybe should be aware of in that process with stuff that might come up later or being flexible as needed to sort of create this together?
Well, oh gosh, okay. So I did have a chance to speak a couple months ago, and I gave a couple of zingers, I'll say, to Keith Wayne, who was really awesome, and he smiled right there in the front row, and it was all okay. We shook hands afterwards, but he was also kind enough to send me send our firm and many others, probably you as well, about any code updates that they were doing. So we wrote our 2-page letter about what some things that could be thought about. And the easiest one is about concealed spaces, and I don't want to harp on that too much because I made a big deal about it on the AIA. But I do think that there is a lot to be learned. What I tried to emphasize in my talk tonight was the depth of thought and research and risk taking that code committee took. Because if those fire tests had failed the way the fire guys thought they were going to, it would have been a disaster. Nobody would be doing mass timber or talking about it everywhere, even though you could still build up to 6 stories. There would be such an issue with that. So the codes were very conservative that were based on those fire tests, which were already very conservative, and they were executed, from my perspective, flawlessly from somebody on the inside. And you can read the 260-page fire report on your own time if you'd like to. That level of investigation and research and analysis was done so carefully that we can really we did go to the code committee at the national ICC level and said, just accept the research. It's been done. If you want to be experts on it, you go read it, but there's just not much you can push back on. And so if I can just say it broadly speaking, to the New York City fire community, which I have deep respect for. I think understanding those fire tests, the veracity and the depth of their work and study and success, both the 5 tests that were done in Washington, DC, as well as the 5 tests that were done in Sweden, has been an extraordinary amount of work. So if the codes happen to be the type 4C codes, next time I was building in New York City, that would be awesome. But I know there's a long history of code progression through every jurisdiction. And so it's kind of like, well, I'm going to go from left-handed to right-handed. And it's easy, right? I draw with my right hand instead of my left hand. Well, that's not really the case. And we all know that. We're professionals enough. So I know there's a long history and we need to respect that. But those codes were really well done. And I think they're good.
Switching gears a little bit, at the very beginning, you talked about, the sort of back and forth between practice and research, practice and code committees, and what's that done, for your practice, generally, and how that keeps progressing. So I'm curious, what do you see for research headed into the sort of midterm, future for you and for the industry as a whole that's needed?
That's a great question. I mean, just a general piece. I mean, there's a number of architects in this room and a number of architects probably listening and maybe in the future as well. I mean, the research that we have conducted has been one of the most incredible sources of creativity and delight that our firm could have ever engaged in. And because it's been designer-led, I hope you picked up this message that I was trying to deliver, that I am not a nerd. I am a nerd, of course, but I'm a geek, but I'm not, it's not my world. My world is that of design and creating beautiful spaces for people. And to begin to then take that side of my brain and take the other side of the brain and switch them all up, or however it works, and to put it into the design, into the research world for the code process, for instance, was still with the designer's brain leading that. Like as an example, how much of the ceiling was going to be exposed. I mean, a lot of the researchers just wanted to put a little patch, a piece of gypsum wallboard from one end of the wall to the other, about 6 inches deep and 6 inches wide on the ceiling. And that would just take care of their worry at that joint. Well, first of all, the worry was incredibly conservative, but as a designer, I was horrified. No architect is going to build a structure with a wall, a CLT wall and a CLT ceiling with this Band-Aid on the whole thing at the cornice line, of course. Like you might as well just stop right there, people. And I told them that, and so they compromised reluctantly, and they did on half the beam, but not the other half, so they could test what the results were. And of course, the results were exactly the same. So it was no problem. We could take the Band-Aid off, and it's going to be good. So that kind of designer-led research, I think, is a really powerful skill that we all have as architects to begin to kind of see the bigger picture, to see the beauty in some of these projects and designs and code structures, which has been really gratifying to our practice. Near term, we just received as partners another couple of wood innovation grants for some projects in California that we're working on, that we're really excited to start this fall. Mass timber office building, and as well a really interesting grant that I honestly don't know that much about. We just were awarded it a couple of weeks ago by the Department of Defense of all places, and to work again with the University of Washington on how residual layers of wood. They own, the DoD nationally, US base owns 6.8 million acres of forestry. And so how those forests get managed and how that wood gets managed is a process that they're hoping to have some exploratory work, and we're excited about.
Great. I'll end with my last question, which is, what do you think the biggest risks are today and opportunities for the mass timber movement?
Got to get more stuff built, guys. We just got to build. I mean, the interest rate did not help us all. Yeah. We were on our absolute roll, and we were just moving ahead so fast. And then project after project after project has not been able to pencil. Not necessarily because of mass timber, but because of the classic thing that faces every development project, especially in the private sector, but also in the public sector, which is any kind of conventional loan financing is really just tripled in cost. And it's just, that's more than the differential of anything that when you compare concrete to steel, or concrete to wood to mass timber. So I really think, there's macroeconomic issues facing the industry right now, which have very little to do with mass timber. But of course, any delays in this uptake, we know that can make an impact on people's, excitement and confidence and just ability to get projects done. We all want more of them. I think there's a huge good faith effort and a really incredible surge of projects that are underway and are on paper and are still coming out of the boards. And I'm actually really thrilled about the progress. I can't believe that my little 4 buildings in 2016 are now dwarfed by some thousands of buildings that are built nationally. So I'm really thrilled.
Well, let me ask one final question of you both, because Kirsten, your experience with Intelligent City is with prefabrication, which I assume has volumetric. It's just panelized. Well, maybe you could explain to people what that is. And also how kind of the two of you think that that as a solution to economies of scale, let's say, as an approach rather than bespoke design, which you know you rightfully insist is is your passion and your contribution. I mean, it's not your entire contribution.
Thank you. I mean, I'll let Kristen speak because we've had this conversation forever about, product versus system, or product versus building. And one of the things that I've learned anyway is that the volumetric modular probably is not as sophisticated is a way that's going to open up for mass timber as strongly. And the panelized system, which Intelligent City is embracing, is a really interesting opportunity. I didn't show a whole series of projects, smaller projects that we've been doing in the lower missing middle and single family area of modular housing, but they're also prefabricated elements. And so the two-dimensional ability to stack the mass timber, because every piece of mass timber is already a prefabricated element, much like our windows and doors are, but we don't think of them as prefabricated, but of course they are. So we have thousands and thousands and thousands of prefabricated elements coming to our sites every day. But I really appreciate the approach that Intelligent City has been taking, and I'm really excited to see their new building going up. You're a new building in Vancouver.
Yeah. So just to give a little brief, I guess, primer on prefab versus modular. So modular construction is typically known as like volumetric modular, where you're shipping completed boxes or, generally completed boxes of space to site on a truck, and then you're stacking boxes or modules to create a building. So a good example of that is there's a shop building next to the Barclay Center. It's an apartment building, Dean Street. That was a modular steel building, boxes stacked. So what we're doing is prefab. We're using mass timber to make the superstructure, so the columns, and then floor cassettes with integrated mechanical and electrical embedded within them as a flat pack solution, as well as the envelope panels. So we have essentially like a unitized curtain wall system, but using mass timber as the structural base, and then punched window approach, all designed to passive house standards. And that's also panelized. So all of that gets shipped flat packed as panels to the site. So you're not shipping air, which is the main difference between, the volumetric approach and the prefab approach. We can ship without the air constraint, and also sort of shape constraint that requires for shipping long distances on trucks and trains and things like that. But still using mass timber. And I think for us, what we're really trying to do is scale specifically sustainable housing, using prefab components and a prefab design approach, which is all based out of Vancouver, British Columbia. We have our fabrication facility up and running, we have a factory there, and we are in construction right now on our first project there in Vancouver. We're really hoping that taking a lot of the ideas that Susan talked about today with a systems approach, like a lot of this really works well. We don't need to reinvent a lot of this, and just taking that to the next level into really manufacturing. And we have dimensional flexibility without changing the system or the approach or the manufacturing line. And that allows us to scale in a cost-effective way and hopefully really reduce the cost of housing generally across the continent here. So that's the approach we're taking. It does mean that, there's a level of standardization in the design that we would like to see to increase the economies of scale that we can get. But it doesn't mean that you can't be creative. Our systems are designed not to look like boxes stacked together. So there's a lot of design flexibility there, a lot of play. And ideally what's happening is that there's actually a bit more collaboration with the manufacturer and the architect up front to talk about the fun stuff, which is the design of the building, and not the not so fun stuff, which is like, how does this go together and what's the fire stopping detail? And so that's the approach we're taking. And I love, Susan's approach to Heartwood and trying to take that and replicate it, because that is necessary in order to really scale housing. And I think it's a good way that mass timber can move forward in a way that we can't necessarily do with other materials, just because of the nature of that material being fairly lightweight and machinable.
I mean, to your point, like I think you take a project with prefabricated elements, or even a sort of designed system, modular system, like I would call Heartwood. But I think as an industry, and I'd love your opinion on it, Kristen, that we're sort of like in the 1920s. And there's this new thing called, well, concrete's not so new. But we have concrete and we have reinforced steel, which allows us to build longer spans. And we all know the book of Codifying towards new architecture and how new spatial configurations and new building types were arising in that beautiful simple page book that he wrote some 100 years ago. And I sort of feel like we're at that point where we're beginning to develop protocols and standards and systems, which will then for the next generation of architecture just become, well, of course you have mass timber, it's 15.6 on center and that's the structural grid. And like, you don't even think about it. And like, yeah, you just put in the spec that you need, this system and the structural engineers know what it is, and the contractor knows, and the fireproofing details are all like, well, you got to do that. And the fire stopping has to work. Don't you know that? Yeah, of course you have to do that. Just stuff that you learn as a young, especially corporate architect working in larger scale firms, that this is just the way you do it. And the contractors know this is just the way it costs. And then you have to build this way to get these buildings built. And we're not quite there as a mass timber industry, but we're developing really fast, those systems of knowledge, which will just permeate the entire industry in a few years.
Well, from your lips to God's ears.
Okay.
Please, everybody, join me in thanking these two really. The museum has been exploring the history, the short history, and the promising future of mass timber in a series of lectures. And many of you have already joined us, and I certainly recommend the other lectures in the series, which are on video on our website and on our YouTube channel, because we've already heard a kind of primer on mass timber from Michelle Roloffs and Tanya Luthi on Mass Timber 101. We've heard about designing the forest from Lindsay Wickstrom. We have heard from Chris Sharples and Thomas Robinson, so a New Yorker, and Thomas Robinson, a Portland Pacific Northwest architect, and we continue the regionalism theme tonight with Susan Jones. We've heard about the bi-coastal beginnings of mass timber more than, well, a decade ago, but even beyond that. And so with all of these lectures, we're trying to bracket the kind of the origin history of mass timber in North America, and where in the works of the architects and engineers, we think, and with the government embrace of mass timber, where this movement stands today, and what are the prospects of the future, a promising future, but one which always seems a little bit on the launching pad, but with a kind of failure to launch. So what does it take for these issues to come together? And one of the things kind of inserted into this this evening's title is Mass Timber by Code and at Scale. How do we scale up? And Susan Jones is an architect who has worked for almost 20 years in the area of mass timber, increasing her scale. And as many of you know, in her very recently completed project, which is called Heartwood, which is included here in the exhibition, she has scaled up in a workforce housing project, which is particularly good news because it makes the argument that mass timber is economic, it's affordable, and it's scalable to solve the problems of affordable housing today. And she's going to talk about that as well as other projects, indeed one that she's engaged in New York now, because she's here tonight from Seattle as one of the architects in the exhibition that are from Vancouver or Seattle or Portland, who constitute a regionalist approach, a kind of ethos of the forest and aesthetic of wood, which also has within its orbit a history of logging and of the industry of timber that makes that place, I think, truly an incubator of ideas that have that have informed in every way the thinking, the education, and then the work of the architects who are speaking in this series. And I think we have a lot to learn from them. So I will just quickly go through these slides and let Susan come onto the screen. But you are sitting in the gallery, and the people who are listening online are not seeing you, but you are occupying the space that you see here that features buildings at different scales, at different heights, including tall timber towers, as Michael Green spoke about just 2 weeks ago, his interest in scaling up in terms of the number of units, but also in the heights of buildings, which is the next step to go as well. And I'm also including one of focusing on one of the bays and the cases in the exhibition in order to remind myself that after Susan's presentation, we're going to have a conversation and a dialogue with her friend and colleague, Kirsten Slavin, who also spent time in the Pacific Northwest, but is now back here in New York and has had experience at Kaiser and Path. So in the slide that you're looking at, the smaller of the, actually, she worked on both of the buildings that are inside of that case. And Ben Kaiser is an architect and developer who's worked on these projects, and Kirsten worked on them as well. She then spent some time with Sidewalk Labs in the New York office, and many of you know the project that did fail to launch on the Toronto waterfront for a variety of reasons, but that promised to scale up into a demonstrable project of both production and then the completion of whole neighborhoods made of timber multi-story buildings. And she is now currently at a company called Intelligent City, which works on sustainable housing and prefabrication in very interesting ways. And so in that conversation, Deb will tell you better than I can here how the future of timber can be envisioned with all of these innovative projects, but especially with sustainable values. I am promoting for the end of this month as well the panel talk or program by Eleanor Gansky and David Lewis, the title of which is Upfront Carbon, about embodied carbon. And we call it the now narrative, because this very important idea of the carbon that is sequestered or the carbon that is not expended or escaped into the atmosphere of embodied carbon is really a key issue in the value and the carbon mitigation problems for climate change that compel us to think of mass timber as a solution. So as thought leaders and as terrific architects who are showing us the way, I introduce Susan Jones.